Hello there, kia ora. Sorry, I'm in the kitchen making coffee because it's Sunday morning and it's been a very weird weekend. It's been such a weird weekend that last night I ended up with a dance party that involved a couple of local board members. Yeah, very strange. And it's been strange in terms of the stuff that I normally make videos on. There has been some really weird stuff happening that I didn't get a chance to cover this week, and I did a speed run on Thursday of all of the really weird things that were going on at that point. And that was before the Labour Party reshuffle or the weird thing that happened with Lester Levy and getting rid of a commissioner for Health New Zealand and replacing it again with a board like they had beforehand when things actually worked better than they do now. Not perfectly, but certainly work better than they do now. Or even Winston's weird anti-woke DEI thing that he did where he put a bill into the biscuit tin about stopping woke DEI practices, which is based technically on a bill that he himself agreed to in 2020. But, Donald Trump said woke bad, DEI bad, a policy so strange that it meant that the US government had to take away pictures of the Enola Gay, the ship that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, because it had the word gay in it. It's getting ridiculous. And to see Winston doing something like that, it doesn't surprise me. He hasn't been in the news a lot lately. David's been taking up oxygen. So, Winston has to do something to get back his fan base, the ones that decided to camp out at the illegal occupation in Wellington, because they're his best friends until he does something that they don't agree with, and then they're going to drop him like he's a hot rock of some kind. Anyway, I might look into that later on this week. In the meantime, this is just the weekly Omnibus with every other video, short form stuff that's been done during the week. So I guess sit back and enjoy. And if you haven't already, feel free to hit that subscribe button or share the video or like the video. But yeah, I'll catch you guys at the other end. Hello there, kia ora. It's always important to know your own biases, and I must confess, I have a bias on today's piece. I fucking hate Marmite. The taste is awful and the smell makes me gag. As a child, I once told my brother, who loved the goop, that it was made up from crushed spiders just so he wouldn't eat it anymore, and we didn't have to have it in the house after that. I'm very clearly biased against it. So, when the Prime Minister got fed up with media asking him about the school lunches debacle and snapped that if parents don't like the school lunch program, they should make their kids some Marmite sandwiches, well, my initial response is probably more extreme than others, and I felt that it was a cruel and unusual form of punishment for people who didn't seem grateful enough for the benevolent free school lunches that his government are providing. Now, there will always be people out there who get upset at the idea of children getting food in schools, demanding personal responsibility from parents, because they're either cruel and heartless or aren't aware that the Universal School Lunch Program in schools has some really wide-reaching positive outcomes. In a cost of living crisis, it saves the average family with two kids about $62 a week, or $2,000 a year. A US study showed that this can save about 5% on the monthly grocery bill. When rates, rents, food, fuel, power, medical, and transport costs keep going up under the laser focus of the government, a government which put a freeze on working for family adjustments that heavily impacted single parent families this week, which netted them just $970,000 extra, well, that money can make a huge difference for low income earners, middle income earners, any income earners. There's also evidence that healthy eating habits in schools influence healthier eating habits at home and drives an overall improved diet for the entire family. A healthy diet at school has also been shown to improve children's mental health outcomes, dental health, and reduces the risk of chronic diseases later in life. And a universal approach to lunch provision has been shown to reduce stigmatization of recipients, which reduces waste from the lunches. It improves behavioral issues in schools, like reducing issues around bullying and violence. And it helps improve academic outcomes in measured testing in both English and mathematics. Those basics the government wants done brilliantly. So there is a lot riding on these programs doing well. It's not just about a free lunch. The positive benefits are huge and long-lasting and impact a huge range of areas that we all want to see improvements in. So when the school lunch program had its overhaul to save money for those landlord tax breaks and unaffordable tax cuts, there was always going to be scrutiny on them. And under that scrutiny Compass Group, who are the group in charge of the new program, they did not deliver. I mean, literally, that was the first issue to crop up, was schools whose lunches weren't delivered. Since then, we've seen a constant stream of issues, from tasteless goop served daily for nearly a fortnight to halal meals with ham, vegetarian meals with meat, and this week we've had plastic melted into the food and seen massive amounts of unappealing meals given away because the kids would rather go hungry than eat them. And the response from the government has been to pass the buck. The Prime Minister keeps saying it's David Seymour's problem. Seymour is calling it a teething issue. Erica Stanford, the Education Minister, demanded a meeting on Tuesday with Seymour over the issue, which he missed, all while the press hound the MPs about the steady flow of complaints from those who are dealing with the issues at the coalface. And the reason it keeps being an issue is because the issues with the end product keep happening. It's not like having a party president convicted of historic sexual abuse charges that was kept out of the media for years by using name suppression laws, then dropped by the media days after it became public, so no hard questions were ever really asked of the party leader about his knowledge and involvement in the topic. After all, the fact is, this government claimed it wants to make decisions based on facts and evidence. And the facts and evidence here are really clear. A comprehensive school lunch program has far-reaching positive outcomes for our rangatahi, and that's before even looking at the economic benefits to local communities under the previous system. The Prime Minister keeps saying he wants the best outcomes for young people. His government rushed through changes, taking money from Te Reo Māori courses and lying about their outcomes, going on air to say schools should consider ignoring the humanities to focus on getting those outcomes in reading, writing and maths, after using erroneous data to justify rushed curriculum changes. They rushed in half-completed teaching resources which added to educators' workloads as they filled the gaps needed to teach the changing curriculum. And here is an undertaking that has mountains of international research behind it that says it will help achieve that. And the reaction when that turns out to what we can only hope is turning to custard is to pass the buck and make out that parents should be grateful that anything is happening at all. And then he goes and adds insult to injury by invoking Marmite into all of this. Like our rangatahi haven't suffered enough. Hello there, kia ora. Do you know what happens when you create and implement changes that drive away our skilled workforces to a place where they're going to get better pay, better costs of living, better standards of living, and less stress, with a brighter future for them and their children? Well, you end up having to create stopgap measures that fill the holes in the leaking boat, and that's exactly what we've seen the past few days out of the government. Last week, Education Minister Erica Stanford announced a new straight-to-residence pathway for primary school teachers. It's based on one that they did last year for secondary school teachers. Now, it should be noted that part of the reason for an increased demand in teachers comes down to the Education Ministry having updated data that calculates the number of teachers that are required. But it should also be noted that this isn't the only reason that numbers need to be bolstered. Research undertaken last year showed teachers leaving for overseas was one of the two most common reasons for teachers leaving. The other was retirement. That 27% of advertised positions in secondary schools could not be filled, and 1 in 10 advertised positions had no applicants at all. And this is an issue impacting places all over the world, with a worldwide teacher shortage happening right now. So the prospect of coming to a place where the new curriculum and education is demanding the latest in educational outputs, like learning cursive and being forced to study medieval epic poems while the person who wrote the curriculum gets to go to select committees to praise measures that minimize equitable outcomes for Māori, while living in a country with an expensive cost of living, in the midst of the worst recession since the early 90s and surrounded by our failing infrastructure and our public services, where a minority party with way more influence than their 8% should give it tries to gaslight educators and say that principals are wrong when they say that the poorest communities have the worst educational outcomes and correcting that would benefit everyone. I'm sure that really appeals to anyone looking to move here. Then this week, the Prime Minister and Health Minister announced a new fast-track pathway for up to 100 overseas trained doctors and cash initiatives for overseas nurses. This fast track will take 2 years to come into effect, and we'll see those doctors out and about helping people then. So hardly a quick fix, but announced the same day as the Public Service Association released survey data that shows 81% of healthcare workers say that cuts have damaged health services, that 86% of them say that these cuts make it harder for people to access healthcare, and 72% of them felt that the sector was underfunded. And while the government crows about the investment in the budget, it's not keeping in line with rates of inflation and population growth, so it becomes a shortfall in funding. Or, as the government calls it, overspending, because it's not giving the sector the funds it needs while culling what it considers backroom staff. Like the IT departments in charge of ensuring fractured, regionalised systems that house all our records that are under constant attack from hackers. That's the kind of backroom staff they're looking at getting rid of. That was always going to impact frontline services, despite what the government's claimed, with a commissioner now who has a vested interest in seeing private healthcare providers succeed. Well, that's all overspending, apparently, not underfunding, and it's not the fault of undervaluing one of our largest parts of the entire government public sector. It does raise an interesting question for me, though. If the funding increase in the budget was so amazing, then why did the government need to sink in all of this extra cash to fill the gaps? So weird how that happened. Probably has nothing to do with the fact that we have a shortage of junior doctors here, exacerbated by the better financial return that they get from just moving over the ditch as soon as they graduate. Oh, and thrown into the mix to stem the issues will be something called a telehealth system, which will act like a remote GP that you call up, which will apparently be staffed by doctors and nurses, so it's not going to be a free service. Doctors and nurses who are already stretched to breaking point because they're doing the work in both the front and back lines in an aging, stretched system that's been underfunded for years. So I'm sure nothing could possibly go wrong with that. Immigration is part and parcel of the way any country operates, but the numbers that we've been seeing over the past 12 months show a mass exodus happening which impacts important services like education and health. And funding cuts, not funding to rates of inflation and population growth, indiscriminate hacking and slashing of public service employee numbers to make sure landlords get their tax breaks. It makes announcements like these ones feel like rushed stopgap measures, like someone working in the boiler room of the Titanic with a bucket trying to stop the ship from sinking. Hello there, kia ora. It's been a bit of a whirlwind week with lots of shock twists and turns, like the writers of Shortland Street have been scripting what happens around politics and in Parliament. We had Richard Prebble, one of the architects of the neoliberal hellscape that we call modern life and former leader of the ACT Party, quit the Waitangi Tribunal he was appointed to before he even looked at a case because of the imaginary fear of it making the country a socialist utopia. Of course, if he had paid attention, then he would have realised that going into the role, and pointing out that you believe Māori never ceded sovereignty and are willing to ignore international rules around treaty agreements with Indigenous peoples, which recognises Indigenous language versions of documents as the ones valid under law, and other little things like that. Maybe he probably wasn't the right person for the job, which even Christopher Luxon alluded to. But he gets to quit publicly in a Herald op-ed while opinion pollsters are making calls, so it's perfect for the ACT fan base fodder machine. We saw a Canadian billionaire try and shake up the board from NZME, a Canadian billionaire who funded disinformation spreader Chantal Baker and her alternative media organisation and set up the Centrist, strange name for something so right-wing, and New Zealand News Essentials, and has links to people who called equity programs communism and questioned if 9/11 was an inside job, and holds a firm belief that New Zealand mainstream media, like this, is way too left-leaning in its bias. I'm sure nothing bad could possibly come from that. We saw David Seymour twice avoid a conversation with Education Minister Erica Stanford, like she's a tough question about Tim Jago and what Seymour knew about him. And that was before a child in Gisborne got second-degree burns from the lunches spilling onto them when they tried to open the half-melted plastic covering off a cottage pie. We saw Winston Peters, the bastion of, my party's going to throw racist shade at Mexicans because of free speech, fire the High Commissioner to London without talking to the Prime Minister, then claiming he could do what he liked because Luxon wouldn't be PM without him. Ironically, Peters probably wouldn't be in Parliament this term if Luxon hadn't said that he would work with him. And what did London Commissioner Phil Goff do that was so horrible? He questioned at a European Leaders Summit if Donald Trump understood the history and contextual elements that led to World War II, framed around a quote from Churchill, which was linked to the bust of Churchill in the Oval Office. How very dare he? We saw Adrian Orr, the Reserve Bank governor, quit unexpectedly and without explanation. We saw Simeon Brown remove funding from a program to test Māori and Pacifica populations for bowel cancer from the age of 50 to redistribute the funds to lower the general screening age to 58. For Māori and Pacifica populations, half of all bowel cancer presentations happen before they're 60, while for non-Māori it's only a third of all cases. And the lower age threshold was in place to ensure better screening for those most impacted by this. So while the slight reduction over 2 years will still help save lives, it will again disproportionately impact Māori and Pacifica populations negatively. We learned that the break fee from Hyundai for cancelling the IREX ferry project is $300 million, which is only $55 million more than the cost of the first home grant that this government cancelled, or double what was saved in the first year by re-indexing accommodation supplements, temporary additional support, special benefits, and income-related help from MSD. An iron sand mining group, one that Minister of Mining Shane Jones had to recuse himself over when it came to fast-track approvals bills, was convicted and fined for releasing 1.8 million litres of sediment-laden sludge into coastal waterways in the Waikato in January of 2023, which was, and this is true, before the trio of MPs sat down to decide if it was able to get approval for the fast-track process that they gave to them eventually, that they told us would never really impact the environment in a negative way. And both Labour and National are playing a weird tit-for-tat game over Homer Simpson walking backwards into a bush on social media. It's a lot, it's overwhelming, and it's easy to lose the good news in the mix. So I wanted to highlight some good news to finish off today. The police have agreed to no longer send people for rehabilitation to Destiny Church's Man Up and Legacy courses. After the violent attack in Te Atatu, calls have been made about repercussions to the organisations linked to the church, from classifying them as a gang, putting them on a terror watch list, losing their charitable trust status, and ensuring their courses, which domestic violence groups have criticised, are not being used by the police or courts. Well, yesterday the police announced that people will no longer be referred to Destiny Group courses like Man Up or Legacy after a review following the Te Atatu attack. Of course, this weekend is the Wellington Pride event, and the organisers have had to increase security from concerns that people linked with these groups will once again cause disruptions. But this is a small win in a world where sometimes it feels like good things don't happen anymore. But they do, they're just buried and overshadowed sometimes. Hello there, kia ora, and welcome to this week's The News. Hyundai is reportedly considering making a bid on the proposed new ferry replacements after a meeting between executives and Foreign Affairs Minister Winston Peters. Said a spokesperson for the company, "We are one of the few places in the world with the dedicated infrastructure to complete such a task. After all, that's why you chose us in the first place, before you cancelled. But if an idiot wants to pay us twice for doing the same job at a higher rate, since we can't trust the decision not to be changed again, then who are we to say no?" Justice Minister Paul Goldsmith is expected to be demoted shortly after a sporting incident that went awry last Sunday in a quote-unquote friendly game of cricket. The Treaty Negotiations Minister, who once had to confirm to media he was not in fact Māori, dealt the Prime Minister a bowl right to the part of the story nobody hearing or watching the news wants to imagine. Said the Prime Minister of the incident,
"Don't worry, Winston and David have the impacted body parts locked in a very tight vice, so they weren't all that damaged."
Documents released under an OIA show Finance Minister Nicola Willis, seen here telling voters how many terms she expects National to be running the country for, was part of a steering group looking into how to handle the steps after cancelling the IREX ferry builds from Hyundai. The documents revealed the group had suggested careful planned communication with the shipbuilders and quick negotiations to consider the downsized option that was being considered, none of which happened, which show that even when they're directly involved in creating advice, this government still doesn't follow it. Research undertaken by ServiceNow showed that New Zealanders spent an accumulated 24 million hours on hold last year waiting for customer service. The worst offenders were financial institutions like banks and insurance companies, followed by government departments, which recorded an extra average wait time of 30 minutes per call over 2024. Said a spokesperson for the government, well, this is actually part of a very clever plan to increase tourism by making sure every person in the country knows the words to Bic Runger's Sway, which we plan to make everyone sing in unison to break the world record, thus making us famous, thus increasing tourism. Auckland Transport has reported an overall increase in usage, but a massive 12% drop in school children catching the bus since the removal of free public transport for children. Said Transport Minister Chris Bishop, seen here on a scooter which he crashed, spilling coffee on himself on the way to a National Party meeting in 2023, which is also his villain origin story and his mission to eradicate all forms of transport without coffee cup holders. See, our plan to increase alternative transport usage has worked. Adding congestion is an alternative to the way these kids used to take the bus to school. The Department of Internal Affairs has announced a new internal classification system which assigns identifiers or hashes to illegal material such as objectionable video content. Said Internal Affairs Minister Brooke Van Velden, seen here trying on her listening with empathy face for elections, this simple measure will help reduce the number of times our staff are forced to watch disturbing content which may negatively impact them, or show them how extreme some of our ACT voters have become. According to a new survey by Kindle, New Zealanders are checking their devices up to 50 times an hour and developing phantom buzz syndrome, where they believe a notification has arrived when it hasn't. Said one survey respondent, "Have you seen the world out there? There's something new and crazy like every 5 minutes. Of course we're always getting notifications." Air New Zealand CEO Greg Foran, seen here asking if customers on a flight had finished sucking on their lollies so he could take them away, has resigned from the national airline after 5 years in the job. In his resignation letter, Foran said that he felt the airline had been set up to continue its trajectory of growth and now was the time to move on. While no replacement has yet been announced, it's understood a former CEO, seen here pretending to be a plane, may be considering a return. After all, he might not have a job in Wellington for much longer. New Consumer Affairs Minister Scott Simpson, seen here showing an audience how much respect the party has for its leader, has had to hand off part of his portfolio that relates to the supermarket reform plans after he self-identified a conflict of interest, with a family member owning a supermarket. The role now belongs to Finance Minister Nicola Willis, who clearly listens to advice and understands the ramifications of government policy making. Said a spokesperson for supermarkets, "We look forward to working with Willis. The Korean shipbuilders and landlords in this country have clearly done well with her in charge, and we are sure we will too." Documents released under an OIA show that independent consulting company WSP reported to Waka Kotahi show that reduced speed limits in busy areas increased economic productivity, despite claims from the government that speed limit increases are needed to achieve those results. It found that on average, reduced speeds lead to 27 fewer injuries and fatalities on each stretch of road, so that every dollar lost on time between $2 and $10 was saved in costs treating injuries or dealing with deaths. The head of Waka Kotahi at the time the report was made asked ministers to consider ideological changes weren't necessary in the face of evidence-based decision-making. Said Transport Minister Chris Bishop, "La la la la, I can't hear you." Former Prime Minister Helen Clark, seen here with an unfortunate growth at the UN, has questioned New Zealand's involvement in the Five Eyes intelligence network, which she claims has gone from quiet intelligence gathering to dictating policy amongst members, while raising concerns about the current US administration's ability to keep sensitive information secret. Said a spokesperson for the Trump administration, "Yet, New Zealand former lady boss has no idea how President Putin will treat sensitive data." And finally, this weekend, Upper Hutt is celebrating its unique place in bogan history with beers, cars, metal, and mullets on display. Even Mayor Wayne Guppy got in on the action. The genesis of boganism in the area was captured in the 1954 Mazengarb report, which looked at the, quote, moral delinquency of children and adolescents in the area on behalf of the government, which was sent to every home in the country to prove that no matter what generation we're in, young people with their strange haircuts and original thoughts are not to be trusted with the moral fabric or future of society. An outlook enshrined today by the way the coalition government treats both MPs and the general population under the age of 40. Anyway, that's this week's The News. Hey, thanks for checking out this week's Omnibus video. As I said at the start, it's been really hard to keep up with everything that's been going on this week. I didn't even get a chance to talk about how Radio New Zealand just out and out platformed Chris Bishop and his views on Chris Hipkins' cabinet reshuffle. Like, that's news. Like, there was no pushback or anything. It was literally just Chris Bishop going, well, I don't think this is a good reshuffle, but meh. Very weird times indeed. Anyway, don't forget, if you haven't already, hit that like button, share the video, or subscribe to the channel, and you can always become a paid subscriber as well. There's a little button for that down just above the description. It's really appreciated if you want to give me a hand with getting all of this done. It is very strange. Anyway, look after yourselves, live long, prosper, be one with the Force, and I will catch you guys all next time. Hey, thanks for checking out today's video. Make sure you like, share, subscribe so you get more updates as we go along. We deal with these guys for the rest of the year.